Spitting Image has returned, and this time Prince Harry and our direct firing line. The sketch pulled absolutely. It didn't smooth anything over, and it definitely wasn't the kind of gentle celebrity teasing people can laugh off with a grin and a social media post. Legendary puppet satire came back swinging, and the mockery was sharp, relentless, and unapologetic. It targeted the most delicate areas immediately: the ambition, the craving for attention, the imbalance in power, and the contradiction between wanting privacy while constantly remaining in the spotlight. And according to several reports, the response from the Sussex camp was far from relaxed. Now, this is genuinely worth discussing, not because Spitting Image is journalism, investigative reporting, or some carefully sourced documentary. It is none of those things. At the end of the day, it is entertainment, and it should be viewed as entertainment. Satire also plays a unique role in shaping public conversation in a way traditional royal commentary or endless opinion columns often cannot. It creates a moment, a joke experienced by millions of people simultaneously, all arriving at the same conclusion through the same punchline. Long after audiences forget the exact wording, they still remember the observation underneath it all. That is the power of satire. People rarely remember the funniest line. They remember the truth hidden inside the joke. If I'm going to make it in America, I need a lifestyle empire full of creams and wellness supplements. Gwyneth Paltrow has Goop, Kourtney Kardashian has Poosh, Jamie Lee Curtis has Poogert, and now I've got mine, Meg Goo, celebrating the sexy earth goddess in all of us. Tonight, we're going to break down the sketch itself, why it resonated the way it did, what it reveals about the changing public perception surrounding Harry and Meghan, and why a satirical puppet show may currently be influencing the broader discussion around them more effectively than almost anything else in the British media. First, let's look at what Spitting Image actually portrayed, because the details matter far more than simply saying it was brutal. The puppet version of Meghan Markle was presented as intensely calculating, someone obsessed with control, always planning several steps ahead, treating every appearance and every statement as part of a larger strategy built around advancing the brand instead of simply living life naturally. Her desire for celebrity was exaggerated, as satire always exaggerates, but the exaggeration felt deliberate and precise. One scene showed Meghan's puppet interrupting a Michelle Obama book event as though her status entitled her to enter any room she pleased. No more Granny's rules. Don't wear your trousers on your head, Harry. Don't bathe on the butler, Harry. If I want to play polo in my living room, who's gonna stop me? Stop that immediately, mate. The entitlement became the joke, but satire only lands when audiences already believe there's at least some truth behind the observation being mocked. That's how effective satire functions. It doesn't create public perception out of thin air. It identifies a perception already floating around in the culture, confirms that enough people recognize it to understand the joke, and then pushes it to exaggerated extremes until it becomes impossible not to notice. The choice of using Michelle Obama in the sketch was especially interesting because it clearly wasn't accidental. Meghan and Michelle Obama have long been linked together in public commentary, both framed as modern trailblazers, both connected to progressive American cultural and political spaces, both associated with aspirational public identities that naturally attract admiration. But by creating a scene where Meghan's puppet behaves as though access to that world is something automatically owed to her, rather than something earned over time, the sketch was making a pointed observation about the gap between Meghan's public image and the version of her that many critics believe actually exists. The Harry puppet, meanwhile, may have been even more revealing, not necessarily because it was crueler, but because of the version of Harry it chose to present. Instead of the respected prince, the military veteran, the mental health campaigner, the Harry most people spent decades becoming familiar with, the puppet portrayed someone struggling to stay relevant in a world that has largely moved forward without him. Right, I've finished my CV, where it says signature, do I stamp it with the royal seal? That won't be necessary, Mr. Wales. I see your previous occupation was royalty. But it wasn't a job. My wife's got a Netflix empire. He was shown as awkward, uncertain, reactive rather than authoritative. In another scene, Harry was pitching Meghan for acting work almost like a desperate talent manager trying to revive the career of a fading client. What made that moment land particularly well is that it referenced a real and heavily discussed incident. Harry genuinely was filmed speaking to a Disney executive at a film premiere about possible voiceover opportunities for Meghan, a clip that spread rapidly online and sparked widespread commentary of its own. At the time, that particular moment had been noted briefly and then largely faded from public memory. The sketch brought it back, amplified it, and transformed it into a scene that made audiences laugh, while also recognizing something deeper underneath. One detail about Harry's puppet stood out more than almost anything else, and it's what separated this from softer forms of royal parody. At one point, the puppet complained about being fifth in line to the throne, treating that simple fact of birth as though it were some kind of personal injustice. That could easily have remained a minor joke, but the show added another layer. Harry's puppet appeared conscious of the fact that it was itself a puppet, controlled, moved from scene to scene without any real authority over the direction of the story. That single touch elevated the sketch from a surface-level gag into something far more pointed. It became commentary not only on Harry's current position, but on the way many people now interpret the trajectory of the last few years. A man who once occupied a clearly understood role inside one of the world's most recognizable institutions stepped away from it, only to spend the years afterward attempting to build a replacement identity that, in the eyes of many observers, has never felt equally stable or fully defined. The power dynamic portrayed in the sketch was probably the element that generated the widest discussion beyond the individual jokes themselves. Meghan's puppet clearly controlled the direction of events. Harry's puppet simply tried to keep up, reacting instead of leading, following a script that always seemed to have been written by someone else. What I'm producing for you is going to be massive. Tell Elton all about it. It's about a beautiful young swan, but nobody recognizes how beautiful she is until season 2, when everyone finally apologizes to her. That idea, the imbalance, the feeling that one person is steering while the other follows, is hardly new within royal commentary. Versions of it have circulated for years, usually hidden behind carefully chosen wording, attributed to unnamed palace insiders, softened just enough to avoid becoming a direct accusation. Spitting Image removed all of that caution. It stated the observation openly in the one format uniquely allowed to operate without restraint. Satire. No disclaimers, no sourcing, no, according to someone close to the situation. Just two puppet characters acting out the dynamic for a few minutes and allowing audiences to interpret it however they already wanted to. The scene people discussed most involved Meghan's puppet calmly handling Harry almost like a professional assignment instead of an equal partner, composed, strategic, entirely in command, while Harry stumbled awkwardly through situations trying unsuccessfully to catch up. As satire, it is intentionally broad, but it draws heavily from a perception that has existed in commentary spaces since the early Sussex years, and in some circles even before that. The sketch itself does not invent that perception. It discovers it already embedded in the culture, sharpens it, and gives it a visual form through puppets. Whether the perception is fair or accurate is a completely separate issue from whether it holds cultural weight. Spitting Image is not trying to function as journalism. Its role is reflection. It presents audiences with an exaggerated version of something they already partly suspect, amplified enough to create laughter while remaining specific enough to provoke thought. That is what makes satire fundamentally different from every other type of public commentary. It occupies a unique relationship with uncomfortable truths. It can exaggerate without needing to prove every detail. It avoids the normal rules governing direct accusations because the format itself signals immediately that ordinary discourse has been suspended. It does not rely on leaked documents, insider briefings, or official sourcing. It simply takes observations, packages them into humor, and delivers them in a form people remember. A spitting image clip spreads because people find it funny. But after the laughter fades, the underlying observation tends to linger in people's minds far longer than a standard opinion article ever could. The joke is merely the vehicle. The perception underneath is what stays behind. If Palace Insider is giving you the context and perspective other channels leave out, make sure to hit the like button. It genuinely helps the channel reach more viewers. Subscribe to Palace Insider and let us know in the comments. Do you think the spitting image parody was fair satire, or did it cross the line? According to multiple reports, the response from the Sussex camp was not the calm, carefully managed silence that confident public figures usually rely on in moments like this. Normally, the standard strategy when a celebrity is mocked by a comedy show is simple. Either ignore it completely or acknowledge it lightly in a way that shows you can laugh at yourself before quickly moving on. What was reportedly described instead sounded far less controlled. Several reports claimed Meghan wanted an apology from the program. Whether every detail of those reports is perfectly accurate or not almost became secondary, because the very idea of demanding an apology from a satirical puppet show immediately turned into another story in itself. And from a communications standpoint, it is exactly the kind of response most experienced strategists would strongly advise against, because it inevitably draws even more attention to the original sketch. It signals that the satire hit somewhere genuine instead of simply bouncing off without impact. It tells the audience that the response was not calculated or strategic. It was emotional. And that contrast between the polished, carefully controlled public image the Sussex brand consistently projects and the apparently unfiltered emotional reaction triggered by a puppet comedy sketch may actually be the most revealing aspect of this entire situation. Not the puppets themselves, not even the individual jokes or scenes. What matters most is the fact that this particular style of criticism appears to have pierced through defenses that tabloids, royal commentators, biographies, and critics have spent years trying unsuccessfully to break through. The sketch worked because it located the gap between the public narrative and the private emotion, and the reaction, whether intentional or not, appeared to confirm that the gap is real. Now, this is where the conversation becomes more interesting than simply reviewing comedy scenes, because underneath the jokes, spitting image is making a much larger cultural point. The show is not random. Its writers study the people they parody carefully. The traits and observations they choose to exaggerate are selected because they already resonate with enough members of the audience to make the joke understandable. Audience recognition is what transforms an observation into successful satire. So when the show portrayed Meghan as endlessly strategic and Harry as a man struggling to find stable footing, it was not inventing those ideas from nowhere. It was reflecting existing perceptions back at the audience in exaggerated form. At the center of the sketch is a criticism aimed directly at what many people view as the contradiction within the Sussex public identity. Harry and Meghan left royal life presenting their departure as a search for privacy, independence, and freedom from the institutional pressures of monarchy. That has been the core narrative running through nearly every interview, documentary, and public statement they've made since 2020. Their story frames the departure as liberation. Liberation from scrutiny, from restriction, from a structure they believed no longer worked for them. But at the same time, by virtually every visible metric, they have become more publicly exposed, more commercially active, and more dependent on media attention after leaving than they ever were before. Every major project since 2020 has relied on the exact same foundation: their relationship to the royal institution they departed from and the story surrounding that departure. Every interview eventually circles back to palace life. Every commercial partnership depends, at least in part, on the audience's continued fascination with the royal connection. Harry's memoir succeeded because readers were promised access to deeply private family conversations that only existed because of his years inside the monarchy. The Netflix documentary attracted attention because it offered the possibility of insider conflict connected directly to royal life. The broader Sussex brand continues to draw heavily from the imagery and prestige of royalty while operating outside the responsibilities traditionally attached to royal service. That contradiction is exactly what spitting image attacks. The puppets talk endlessly about escaping the system, while every joke gradually reveals that they have reconstructed a new version of the same system around themselves. Instead of palace structures, there are streaming contracts. Instead of royal tours, there are brand campaigns and media appearances. Instead of institutional protocol, there are PR strategies and content operations. The machinery changed. The reliance on public attention, and specifically on the royal story, remained almost identical. That is the central point the sketch is making. And importantly, it is not making that argument through investigative journalism, leaked documents, or palace insiders. It is delivering the message through a comedy puppet show watched by millions of people on social media, where the humor quietly embeds the observation into public consciousness. The next time audiences encounter another Sussex headline, the joke is already sitting in the back of their minds. That is why satire can be so effective. It bypasses many of the normal defenses people build against criticism because it does not initially present itself as criticism at all. It presents itself as entertainment. It cannot easily be dismissed as a tabloid attack. It cannot realistically become the basis of legal action. It simply makes people laugh, and the laughter carries the underlying message with it. There is also something important about the timing of this sketch because it did not emerge in isolation. Spitting Image returned during a period when sections of the British mainstream press have become noticeably more direct and more openly critical of the Sussex operation than they were even a year ago. The internal Daily Mail split between the Project Thaw narrative and Richard Eden-style assessments suggesting public interest in Meghan has weakened. The growing scrutiny surrounding Invictus finances and leadership departures. The anniversary posts that received little visible engagement from major celebrity circles. The broader commentary suggesting that aspirational headlines are increasingly being presented as though they are confirmed developments. All of those stories have been accumulating over recent months, and together they have contributed to a very noticeable shift in tone across parts of the media landscape. Coverage that once felt cautious and carefully balanced now often feels more openly skeptical. Spitting Image did not create that shift. It arrived in the middle of it. But its arrival matters because shows like this usually respond to cultural mood rather than create it from scratch. Satire of this kind tends to follow public temperature, not lead it. The original 1980s version of Spitting Image went after figures like Thatcher and Reagan with extraordinary brutality because they were the defining political personalities of that era, and audiences were ready to see them mocked in that way. The modern version is making similar calculations about what audiences in 2025 are prepared to laugh at. The decision to target Harry and Meghan so aggressively, and in this very specific manner, tells you something important about where the production team believes public sentiment currently sits. They clearly believe the British audience is now far more willing to find this type of satire amusing rather than uncomfortable. They would never have produced this exact sketch in 2019. At that point, the cultural atmosphere was completely different. There was still considerable public warmth toward Harry in particular, lingering goodwill from his military service, his work around mental health, and the years in which he appeared to carry out royal duties with genuine sincerity. But that reservoir of goodwill has, by almost every polling indicator and by the general tone of public conversation, diminished significantly over time. Spitting Image chose to make this sketch now because now is the moment where it works. The cultural permission required to satirize Harry and Meghan with this degree of sharpness, without triggering widespread backlash, is something the writers almost certainly tested before moving forward. And the fact that they not only moved forward, but did so with this level of intensity is itself evidence of where the broader cultural mood currently stands. The sketch also captures something about Harry specifically that extends beyond the easier jokes surrounding Meghan's ambition or control, and that element deserves closer examination because it is arguably the more thoughtful and less obvious part of the satire. The show presents Harry as a man who once possessed a clearly structured identity, Captain General of the Royal Marines, patron of organizations carrying genuine institutional importance, deeply embedded inside a framework of purpose provided by the monarchy, and who now finds himself navigating a world where none of those structures exist anymore. That observation is more nuanced than simple ridicule, and to the show's credit, it deserves to be recognized as such. Even inside the comedy, there is something faintly melancholy about the portrayal. The puppet aware that it is itself a puppet. The man who left behind the institution that once defined him only to discover that the identity built afterward never fully achieved the same coherence or stability. That is not pure cruelty. The sketch seems to approach Harry with a strange kind of reluctant recognition, acknowledging the real difficulty of his situation while still finding humor in it and refusing to pretend those two things cannot coexist. And that complexity is exactly what separates strong satire from shallow mockery. Simple mockery says, "You are ridiculous." The sharpest satire says, "You are human. This is where you ended up." And the distance between where you imagined your life would go and where it actually arrived contains something undeniably comic. The spitting image version of Harry sits somewhere inside that second category, which, oddly enough, is almost a form of dignity being extended to him even while he remains the target of the joke. Whether audiences actually perceive that layer of sympathy inside the humor will depend entirely on what they already believe about the last 5 years. The Sussex story has become attached to so many pre-existing opinions about class, celebrity, monarchy, media culture, and what public figures owe the public that two people can watch the exact same sketch and leave with entirely opposite interpretations. If you already believe Harry made a major mistake by leaving royal life and has struggled ever since to replace the stability he abandoned, the sketch reinforces that perspective. If you believe he made the correct decision and has been unfairly attacked ever since, then the sketch feels like one more example of a culture unwilling to grant him the separation he wanted. That division is ultimately why the Sussex story still generates this much intensity half a decade after the departure. It has evolved into something larger than Harry and Meghan themselves. It functions almost like a cultural Rorschach test for opinions and frustrations that existed long before they entered the picture and will likely continue long after they are no longer central figures in public debate. Spitting Image did not invent those divisions. It simply located the exact point where all of them overlap, placed two puppets inside that space, and allowed audiences to project everything else onto them. And perhaps the most revealing detail of all is the reported reaction itself. According to several accounts, Meghan was genuinely angry about the sketch. Angry enough, reportedly, to want an apology. That matters not because it somehow proves the satire was accurate, but because of what it suggests about the relationship between the Sussex public image and the unique kind of criticism satire represents. For years, the standard response to negative coverage has generally followed a familiar pattern: challenge the reporting, dispute the framing, pursue legal action where possible, or describe the criticism as the product of a hostile and agenda-driven British press. That framework has worked reasonably well in parts of the American media environment, where the reputation of the British tabloids already provides an easy narrative structure for criticism. But it becomes much harder to sustain when the criticism is coming from a comedy program, from commentators who have often been broadly sympathetic in the past, or from editorial spaces connected to outlets that were previously pushing narratives like Project Thaw. Satire exists in a very unusual position within the media landscape. It cannot easily be dismissed as a tabloid campaign because it is not functioning as tabloid journalism. It cannot simply be framed as palace briefing disguised as reporting. By nature, satire operates more as cultural reflection than editorial argument, and that makes it significantly more difficult to challenge without unintentionally reinforcing the exact point being made. The puppet essentially voiced what a substantial portion of the audience was already quietly thinking. And if the reports about the reaction are accurate, then the response itself suggested that the people being portrayed immediately recognized exactly where the joke had landed. That reaction, seemingly emotional, unplanned, and clearly outside the boundaries of carefully managed strategy, may actually have been more revealing than the sketch itself. The most culturally significant part of the entire episode was not necessarily the satire, it was the response to the satire. Do you think Spitting Image was making a fair and broadly accurate satirical observation about the Sussex brand and the contradiction many people believe sits at its center? Or do you think it crossed the line into something harsher than satire should become? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to Palace Insider so you don't miss what comes next. And if you enjoy this kind of analysis, Dropping a like genuinely helps the channel reach more people. See you in the next one. The broader communication framework that positioned criticism as a form of institutionally motivated attack was built to deal with a very specific type of opposition. Spitting image does not fit that category. You cannot realistically describe it as a tabloid vendetta because it is not a tabloid outlet. You cannot accuse it of relying on palace briefings. And attempting to frame a satirical puppet show through the same defensive lens becomes much more difficult because the usual responses simply do not map neatly onto this kind of criticism. And by reportedly seeking an apology from a comedy program, the reaction may have unintentionally reinforced the very point the sketch appeared to be making, that the distance between the carefully projected public confidence and the private emotional response may be larger than the communication strategy is capable of concealing. The puppets identified that gap. The reaction, at least according to the reports, appeared to confirm it. And that combination, the observation itself, the laughter surrounding it, and the seemingly unguarded confirmation from the people being satirized, is what transforms this from an ordinary comedy sketch into a genuinely notable cultural moment within the larger Sussex story. That is also why this particular sketch will likely remain memorable long after audiences forget the exact jokes themselves. There is one final point worth making before leaving the subject entirely. The fact that a puppet comedy show has generated this level of serious discussion is itself part of the story. Spitting image is fundamentally entertainment. Its first responsibility is to be funny. Any deeper cultural commentary exists second to that primary purpose. But when entertainment becomes large enough to create its own media cycle, spark extended public debate, and reportedly provoke a meaningful reaction from the very people being mocked, it moves into a strange middle ground where it simultaneously functions as both comedy and cultural commentary. A satirical program that audiences discuss almost like journalism, and that its subjects reportedly respond to as though it required a formal communications reaction. That is what makes this moment culturally unusual. And that mixture, the humor, the wider cultural significance, the mass public reach, and the apparently unusually candid reaction from the subjects themselves, is what makes this worth understanding as something larger than just another television sketch. It is funny television, yes. But it is also funny television that reveals something real about where the broader cultural conversation currently stands. Do you think Spitting Image made a fair, satirical point about the Sussex brand and the contradiction many people see at its center? Or did the sketch go too far? Drop your opinion in the comments below. Subscribe to Palace Insider so you don't miss what comes next, and a like genuinely helps us reach more people who enjoy this kind of analysis. See you in the next one.